Hi, welcome to Character Flaws, where we do deep dives on player character classes. Welcome. 3, 2, 1. Hi, I'm 3, 2, 1. Hi, I'm Reed. This is Character Flaws, where we do a deep dive on player character classes. Today, we're doing the Barbarian. Let's go. Right, a barbarian in D&D terms is a warrior who is fueled by strength and who is fueled by emotion, usually rage. Intellectually and in the real world, barbarians occupy a lot of space, and we'll get to that in time, but for now we're just going to focus on what is in front of us. In game terms, this emotion is called rage, but you could call it whatever you liked. You could call it focus, you could call it, berserker. You could call it the bear spirit to suggest that you're possessed by something. Or maybe you're in a Zen trance, so deep you're dissociating. But whatever it is that it is an important part of the barbarian character class, this rage mechanism, no matter how you call it. But what separates barbarians from the fighters isn't just a damage bonus, which is what rage is. It's a reliance on the physical body that no other sort of melee character class has. Monks have ki power. Fighters know all these martial arts and techniques and things. Rangers, they have pets, they have spells. Paladins, of course, gods on their side. But barbarians are sheer physical power. Their body is all they have. Their strength is all they have. Their rage is all they have. And that's something that's unique to D&D character classes, especially in 5th, where there's a lot of sort of implicitly magical characters and a lot of implicitly in touch with supernatural powers characters. Barbarians are one of the very small amount of character classes that don't have that. They have just pure body. So if you're interested in being a barbarian, if it's really what appeals to you, and you don't want to bugger eyes around with being a tactician or a planner, or if I cast this spell and I cast that spell, if you're like, nah, sort of, I'm going to headbutt him until he's dead, and then I'm going to resurrect him, and then I'm going to headbutt him some more. Also, I would like to punch now. That's a barbarian. You don't have to be stupid. You don't have to be impulsive. You don't have to be me want food, but you do have to solve your problems, primarily. Bit of beef. So what can we learn from pop culture and history that can teach us about this class? Where did the designers draw their inspiration from? Now, foolishly, pop culture is somehow not designed for game rules in mind. So Conan is actually not a particularly good example of how a barbarian would play on the tabletop. He doesn't have any of the rage. He has a lot of skills that a barbarian wouldn't necessarily have, but nevertheless he's got the look down pat. He's perfect in that respect. But you should also go and maybe have a read of some of the short stories and the novellas and things, because A, they're pretty fun, and B, he loses his temper more in those. But what else could we got? We got Drax from the Guardians of the Galaxy. He's a classic barbarian. He's only fighting with sort of primitive weapons. You don't see him with many lasers and things like that. He's all emotions all the time. He clearly comes from a tribal culture. Logan Ninefingers from the Joe Abercrombie books, from what are they called? The First Law books or something? Half of you were actually going like, what about Logan Ninefingers? Because it's I don't know if that dude is involved in RPGs and stuff, but he's perfectly the experience of playing a barbarian. The rage comes on him, and he hits harder, he hits faster, he's meaner, and he's far more dangerous. Then the rage comes away, and he's a bit appalled at what he's done. It's pretty cool. Those are good books if you like D&D. Fafford, actually, from Fafford and the Grey Mouse's stories, which I know the guys who invented D&D were very, very big fans of. But you should read too, because they're fun. He was smart and witty, and he's been living in a city for a long time, but he's not the best dude with swords, he's not the best dude with fencing, he's just tough and hard and strong. So have a read of those stories. You'll see a lot of what became D&D actually comes from that side of the culture of fantasy writing, not from Tolkien. While Xena herself is not a barbarian, if you've ever seen the greatest TV show ever made, Xena, she has a lot of barbarians in that. She fights a lot. The Amazons are mainly getting by on rage and focus. Some of the monks, though. Hercules, actually, same sort of universe. He'd be a barbarian. He's just like hit it. He doesn't have rage, though, which is funny because the real life Hercules most certainly did. Of course, the distaff to Conan is Red Sonja, but Red Sonja is not a very good barbarian either. Jurel of Joy, I think her name is. Anyway, golden age of science fiction and fantasy, like the 1920s, one of the very first, if not the first, sort of barbarian princess, Jurel, written by a woman. Fantastic stories, really, really good, really, really interesting. Check them out. They've got their own fantasy masterworks, easy to find. Fantastic example of a barbarian. Rich is really good. There's a Korean comic called Warrior Shaman, which I've read a bit of. Fantastic art. That's absolutely the more spiritual side. Same that you could do something like if you ever read that excellent Heathen comic. Same thing is that a young woman falls in love with a Valkyrie, and it absolutely focus them or imagine those two characters as barbarians because they're mainly emotions. And for a younger audience, there's some comics called Princess Ugg. They're much younger. So while you shouldn't discount Conan completely, you see that there's actually a fair amount of conceptual space covered by the barbarian, from the pit warrior of Drax to the Reaver conqueror king, the urbane survivalist. There's lots of ways to be a barbarian. So we'll talk about it some more. So I think it's important to have a bit of historical context to character classes when we can, and to have a look at and think about what large organizations of them might look like and how they might affect history and the society around them. So historically, a barbarian is just someone who didn't speak Greek. That's its primary meaning. But it's now then changed very quickly to mean all those, what they thought of as unsophisticated and uncultured organizations that existed outside of the Mediterranean and the various empires and societies that grew up around there. So basically, if you were not a Roman or a Greek, and you lived around Western Europe especially, but also what we now Eastern Europe, you were a barbarian. And they tended to be horse cultures, nomadic cultures, most of them Christianized pretty early. So, it's a very large, broad meaning of barbarian. Now, of course, while the Romans saw them as very, very uncivilized and very, very cruel, but good at fighting, that wasn't really the truth. If you were a woman, you really wanted to be born in France, with the Gauls especially. We know that some of the English and Irish and Scottish gold working and the famous Celtic knots and things like that. Incredible, beautiful artworks, and we know that they have brilliant oral traditions and all the rest of it. And even then, the barbarians weren't necessarily as bad as the Romans were. I mean, the Romans would crucify your entire tribe. Torture was a bit of fun for them. The Visigoths, after they sacked Rome, they actually left churches alone because they didn't want to. If you took sanctuary in a church, the Visigoths wouldn't come in after you. So even when we think about barbarians, we don't need to think about them necessarily in terms of, I would like to destroy Rome now, dreadlocks. You were just talking about someone who comes from a culture that is outside of civilization. So, again, we have to, if we look at these things on a case-by-case basis, I'm very interested in the Gothic tribes. I think they're quite cool. And again, we see that the Arian heresy and the Bibles that they made and things like that is that There was no doubt they were a barbarian culture, but they were, they had sophistication. They had writing. The Vikings aren't traditionally thought of as a barbarian, but if you want to emphasize that bare fur and I challenge by my blood and Odin's eye, that would be a barbarian culture, even though we know that the barbarians had sophisticated legal systems and parliamentary systems, and women had considerable more rights than almost anywhere in the world back then. But as well is we need to look and contrast all these, what is a barbarian and what isn't, because Scythian horse archers were a very feared barbarian tribe, and they were literally just that. They rode on fast, small horses. They were bandits with the bows, and they never wanted to fight hand to hand. They wanted to just shoot you and run away on their cool horses. The Mongolians, of course, you would call them a barbarian culture, even though we know how powerful they were, and we know that they had sophisticated politics, and they stood up to the cunning Chinese empires. The Yao, the Jackal people, they're an Asian, I think they're Vietnamese, maybe they're Cambodian, but again, a sophisticated culture. Gurkhas have some of the most incredible, beautiful artistry in their clothes, and of course the famous knives. But in these terms that we're talking about, until fairly late, they lived in small communities. They lived without very much technology. There was a harshness of them versus the wild, and that's what you're looking for in barbarian communities. More than anything else, you're looking for an immediate connection with the natural world. I think is what in the real world is a strong indicator of barbarism. And of course, some barbarians were kind of not very cool. So what drove you to become that class? And what drove you to become an adventurer of that class? Well, you can just say, look, it was my culture. I come from a barbarian culture. Vikings, for example, they're a good one to come from. They tend to have ties to fantasy worlds, and they prize physical power and the strength. Mongols really liked to fight, and they had complicated ideas about violence and war. Picts, Celts, Cossacks, Apache Maori. There's no end to cultures that D&D would recognize as producing barbarian character classes. So, if you like, just pick a culture, a world culture, and say, I'm from the fantasy version of that. Or you could get a bit more creative with it. You could say, I come from a Mad Max hellscape, or I come from the demon-haunted tundra where there is only conflict against the supernatural forces of evil. Or my tribe is a slave to a mighty dragon and I escaped, and I am the product of its breeding experiments with humans to create big powerful men. So, there you go. You don't have to go into too much detail to come up with a solid barbarian concept. But you do need to talk about why you left that culture, why you're adventuring. And generally speaking, the characters leave their homes to adventure. So, perhaps you were thrown out because you were too crazy. You're a barbarian, you're a rage monster. Or if you are planning on your character moving towards ancestral spirits, whatever subclass that is, I can't remember. Maybe the gods, speaking through the spirits, ancestral spirits, selected you, or the totems did, or maybe you were just great at fighting, so great that the tribe sent you out into the world and said, come back with 1,000 sculpts, come back with 1,000 monsters. Or perhaps you need to go and prove to yourself worthy of a chieftain, and if you can come back with the head of a dragon or whatever, you will become the chief. So, maybe you are a sort of elite fighter and you have been sent into the world to show that the tribe is the toughest that there is. So, do barbarians study? Do they train? Do they practice? Or are they just born with natural skill? I don't tend to think that barbarians are particularly linked with the thematics of practice and study and rigor. Monks, you think about monks training for 10 years up a mountain, then they get their white belt, then they're ready to go. Wizards hunched over their books for decades learning the language of magic. Fighters with an elaborate study of weapons, maybe they're paladins, lengthy squirehood and pagehoods. But barbarians, you don't think of barbarians as training to be barbarians. They're, it is 3, here is a spoon, go and attack the great beast of blah blah blah. You're a barbarian when you're a kid. My daughter's 3, it's time for her to kill an orc. But did you? Did you have to try hard? Is there something special about you? Were you raised an outsider? Did you have to become a barbarian to survive? Were you alone on the plains? Are you some sort of jungle person? Or a wolf boy? Or this girl was raised by displacer beasts? I think that we'll get to this a little bit later on, but I think that if you want to, you can flavour a barbarian as a kind of lycanthrope if you would like to. So, how did it all work out? And what's your origins? You got to remember is that the chances are good that you're going to be wielding like a big two-handed sword or a battle axe or something like that. These are not hunting weapons. Somewhere along the way, you learn how to fight with a 15 kilo bit of steel or wood or. That's another thing actually. What kind of technology levels did your barbarian have? And do you think it's going to be fun to say like, wow, this steel stuff is fantastic, or metal bird flying? If you like, I tend to think that that's pretty boring. Do it if you like. But some thoughts about what gave you the skills are in order. So where do you fit into the world? Where does your barbarian fit into the world? How does the world see you? It can tell us about our player character if we imagine how we will come across to PCs and NPCs alike. And it also helps if with a character like Barbarian, if you just find out if the DM has any plans for them within the greater world. Other empires? Traditionally, when we're talking about barbarians, we're defining them by their opposition or relationship to empires. Do you have them? Or do you exist in a world that's all pre-iron, pre-bronze? It's all just horse cultures and nomads. Do your people exist within the greater culture? Are you completely foreign? Are you completely exotic? Or is there lots of trade? Traditionally, barbarians could even become members of the empire. Their nations, they had to get together a nation and pay taxes and all the rest of it, and they were pretty much left alone. Maybe you come from that kind of a culture, which means that they will at least know you. Do you have scarification? Do you have piercings? Do you even have specific kinds of haircuts that will always mark you out as a barbarian? Are these considered amazing and interesting and spiritual, or are they considered marks of your degeneracy? Now, not all barbarians have to be xenophobic grunters. Not everyone has to be like, soft city man, I will crush. But it has been a part of the flavouring of barbarians that they are dubious of civilization. Even if they're within civilization, they just find politesse mendacious. They find all of the smiles and handshakes and laws and contracts that you have to sign and all this sort of stuff. It gets in the way of being an honest person. It gets in the way of going about the world in the manner of the barbarian, which is with honour and personal strength and independence. So, does your barbarian feel that? And how does that come across to the people of the empire? Do they think, oh my god, I'm being judged by this lice-ridden creep? This feral grunting pig woman is telling me that I'm somehow dishonest. What we're trying to do here is find sources of tension, not conflicts, just areas where you and the PCs and the NPCs won't have a reason to draw swords on each other or yell at each other or split off from the party forever. Tension. if they are looking at you and going, why are you such a dumb barbarian all the time? And you're looking at them going, why are you such boring private school kids? You've got tension. Or maybe you're going to end up on some of your adventures in cultures that do not even see you as human. And lastly, monsters. How do monsters see you? You have probably come from a culture that has dealt with them a lot. You're very close to nature, and nature's where monsters live. Do you have an ongoing war with orcs? Are you superstitious towards dragons? Do the undead just give you the creeps, and you have to, if you see one, you have to, make a prayer to the gods, or spit on the ground, or make some sort of protective warding symbol? How do the gods see you? How do foreign gods see you? Do the gods of the empire have an oppositional relationship with people who live outside the empire? All useful, all ways to create a more memorable character. Have a chat with your DM. So how are we going to customize this barbarian of yours? What are they going to look like? When you're fighting, what does it look like? Is it all just power moves and screaming out and yelling? Or are you cunning and feral rather than mighty and powerful? Are you screaming in defiance? Or maybe you fight in screaming, feral rage. Maybe you go deathly silent or just make animal grunting noises and you cannot be reached by any of your allies. Maybe you like to sing a sacred death chant during combat. You gods look at me, my soul goes to Crom, that kind of business. Do you like to fight in sacred war paints? If you have time, do you have to perform a ritual before combat? What about when you win a combat? Do you offer up sacrifices to the gods? Maybe do you offer up the enemies as sacrifices to the gods? Have fun with the paladin. Let's have a think about some barbarian concepts. Because you don't have to just be a muscular, I would war. You could be a peaceful shamanic warrior who only draws their steel at the most desperate of times. Perhaps you are an eerie exiled from a tribe who worship ghosts, and you are haunted. They come with you, and that is your ancestors or your totems. Maybe you are an advanced scout for your civilization, and then you're fitting in and getting on with people, and getting information is a very important part of your mission. Maybe you are an explorer. Maybe you are actually a very, very nice person. You were just looking to see what's in the world and you're going to bring information back. It's not your fault that you're a 7 foot tall, 300 kilograms of muscle monster. Maybe you are a brutal savage. Maybe you're a slave that one of the PCs has bought and you are slowly being brought back to humanity on one act of kindness at a time. Maybe you are in fact a strength-based kind of fencer. You use one of those, you've seen them, the flambeaus or something, those huge wavy. So what's multi-class look like for barbarians? Barbarian bards. First off the rank, one of the best ones, skalds. Viking skalds, traditional Celtic bards. These are good examples for barbarians. They are people who are trained in the ancient songs of the people. They understand the laws, they understand the law, they understand the history, and they know the songs that bind cultures together. They know the customs that bind cultures together. They know the ancestry of people, which is important in a pre-verbal culture. They are very respected people because they do keep these lines of communication open and they do remember these things. And again, that's very important. They're pretty fun to play. You might want to look up Kenning. You might want to look up our old Horrible Histories friends, the Boast Battles. Those are all things that will exist within a barbarian bard context. I think that you might want to also look up gods like Odin, the gods of poetry and mead, where art and writing and drama are so powerful to a people who don't have anything else, it seems almost supernatural. Druids. Barbarian druids. Very cool. Two things. Traditional religion of the barbarian people would be druidism rather than clerics, in how we sort of tend to think of these things. A closeness to the wild, a closeness to the landscape. So you could be like a barbarian cleric. You are still called towards the gods. You wish to serve them. Or perhaps you just want to learn the ways of the wild far more. So you go to the local druid or the local witch who knows far, far more about these things than you do, and say, I'm going to live in this wilderness for the rest of my life. I'm going to travel through it. I'm going to adventure in it. Teach me more of its ways. Or, and I like this one, you could make yourself into a kind of were creature, a kind of a feral spirit. Shape changing. You just say, well, I don't turn into a bear. You just say, I've slowly been working my way into a werewolf. By the time you get the shape changing abilities, I'm a werewolf now. And so you make your character all about using the physical elements of the druid. I think you could get a really interesting character class out of that. Your barbarian has gone straight. If you're a barbarian fighter, maybe you've been in the civilized lands for a while now. You think that you need to know how to be excellent with a few other weapons, or maybe you just want to have some cool military tactics, or you just feel like there's other forms of martial arts for you to master. So you take some 5 levels in fighter. If I was coming from a warrior culture that had specific barbarian monks. I would say that you just take a few levels of monk and then you reflavor them just as barbarian abilities. You know, you can leap suddenly at people. Your flurry of blows is just like you just come at them really, really fast. Ki is just another form of rage for you. And if you flavored that as, feral madness, every time you use a ki power, feral madness comes in as the same way as rage. Or perhaps, you're just a wild bastard who can't help yourself. You just gotta get your hands on someone and just, that's the kind of barbarian that you are. I would also potentially flavour that lycanthrope idea from druids, using monks for a different kind of a build. Your hands are claws, you're leaping around places, it's just jumping and the speed of a wolf and climbing up walls with your claws and all the rest of it. I'd consider it. Barbarian paladins. Interesting. My first thought would be something like the Varangian Guard. They were a group of Norsemen who were brought over to the Byzantine Empire to be an elite group. And they became very politically powerful, so you could flavour that as if you want to come and work for us for the big money and the big prestige, say oaths to our gods, become our protector. Or you could just reflavor it as a barbarian gods who need their people. Just because you're not wearing a whole lot of plate mail doesn't mean that you can't be a paladin. Or maybe the oaths that you've taken are to represent your hatred of a civilization, or your fury towards a different tribe or a specific kind of monster, or your desire to protect a certain land no matter what. Or maybe you just reflavored all the different kinds of rage. Laying on hands, you heal yourself is just and you throw off the manacles and you throw off the pain, and smites are just more rage. Ancestral warriors, if you have the ancestors are with you, reflavor it. All your powers not as god powers or oath powers, but just the ancestors are with you, and you the ancestors make sure that you obey the tenets and taboos of your tribe, which is the oath. Barbarian Ranger, very simple. If you're the kind of barbarian who has no truck with civilization, who just doesn't want to go and live there, who's entirely specializing in living in the wild, go and become a ranger. It's very simple. You don't really even need to justify it at all. You're just getting better at living out in the wild. That's it. So you could also just say, look, I'm from a tribe that lived deep in the wilderness. I didn't even see, a civilized person until I was grown. That's just how it is. But I also kind of like the idea of, you're a Grizzly Adams, you're a mountain man, you're a wild one, very, very close to the animals. You remember that dude in True Grit? You remember that dude in True Grit who turns up with like the great bear cloak and the bear costume? And I imagine he would be a barbarian ranger. I always got the impression that he was not a man to get into a fight with. Barbarian Ranger, also, you are a feral human. You have been out in the jungle for too long, and you are not easily going to come back. Barbarian Rogue, bang, Conan, finally, we get there. You might have come out of the most horrific, feral, terrifying, Mad Max horror show, but you've been in civilization for a little while, and you like money, and you know that it's going to be easier for you sometimes to pick the lock rather than break the door down, to remain silent, to move skillfully, to be a burglar and a great fighter. And that is exactly what Conan is. Or you can decide that you come from a tribe that lives in the shadows of great trees, or in a very, very still, cold jungle, or somewhere where silence and stealth is important. So you take a level or two of rogue to give yourself access to those skills, to color yourself as a silent fighter in the jungle. Barbarian Sorcerer. Alright, nearly there. Well, good thing about sorcerers is, of course, you don't really need to justify them. Oh, turns out Dad was a dragon. Or turns out I stood too near that radioactive green rock. Or anything. But for a barbarian, some thematically appropriate things would be the gods heard my call and granted me these powers, or the forces of the wilderness heard me and granted me these powers. Or you could even take only spells that are buffs and enchantments and things like that, and just reflavor them all as rage. But, it's a sorcerer. You don't really need an elaborate backstory. Somehow you got superpowers. Or you were always in training to join the shaman. Now something has happened. Maybe that you have proven yourself worthy through your adventuring, that you now are in the position to go up to him and say, hello, Mr. Shaman, please, I'm ready. And the sorcerer levels represent your training. Barbarian Warlocks. I said darkness, yeah. Alright, Barbarian Warlocks. 3, I think, really flavorful things that you can do with a Barbarian Warlock. Hexblade, first of all. You are such a fan of killing and murder and destroying things with your hands and fists and swords that you found something to sell your soul to help you do it better. I think that this would suit a really scary... I think all Barbarian Warlocks are really great for bad guys. And I think that, if you want to go for that covered in leather and spikes and, death dealer kind of dark warrior, Hexblade Barbarian. Good to go. Second, in the cultural imagination of the Puritans, now I'm not talking about reality, I'm just talking about the cultural imagination. American Indians worship the devil. Alright, the black man who was the devil, who tempted witches, lived out in the woods. And because the American Indians were pagans, clearly they worshipped the devil. Maybe you do. Maybe you are, in fact, a devil worshipper. Maybe the fact that it's a fiend doesn't mean anything to you. Maybe you don't care. Maybe you find that this simplistic morality of these invaders is nonsense. Or maybe you are. Maybe you actually are sworn to evil and always were. And the black man is your patron. Then again, you can also just do I lived in hell and the devils came for us to help us fight the demons. I said yes, and I do not regret it. So that's another one. But the last one, okay, let's be careful here. The last one is the great old ones. Now, this is Lovecraftian fiction, and yes, it's racist, okay? But it's not going to help us to... We just have to take the imagination and remove it from its, toxic wellspring. In Lovecraft, there is a recurring motif of humans who are degenerate somehow. These are people who are not civilized, and these are people who, in their peripheral states, their benighted, ignorant fashions, they have come under the sway of the old ones. These are the cultists in Call of Cthulhu down in Louisiana. These are the esoteric order of Dagon people in Innsmouth, which means that even the wrong kinds of white people can fall under this sway. These are the deathless. These are the primary worshippers of the great old ones. And you, as a barbarian, could very, very well belong to a tribe like that. Maybe you fled from that tribe. Maybe the warlock patronage is something that you were forced into as a child. Maybe you are a missionary or an evangelist for this kind of creature. I think you could also get a lot of mileage out of reflavoring your barbarian abilities in that great old one theme. So you're superhumanly strong because of your gross tentacles. You heal a lot because of a Blade of the Immortal style worms within you that always are healing you up. Your rage is an inhuman alien mindset where you just kill. Great old one warlocks are good villains. Barbarian wizards, surprisingly fun. You just got to flavour the spells, and especially the process of learning spells, because the scrolls isn't going to be all that interesting. So maybe they're runes that you collect and cast each morning and remember, or I Ching sticks that you throw, and that's your study is today I must learn how to do grease. Bones you've carefully sharpened, or shrunken heads that you've collected who whisper the spells to you every morning. Maybe you're just saying a prayer to your patron spirits, your ancestors, or ghosts. Maybe that's how you perceive them. Did you ever read the Deathgate books by Weiss and Hickman? They're not great, but they've got some cool ideas in them. That's what we're here for. They've got some dudes whose magic is all tattoos. They tattoo themselves. I think that if you did a really kind of awful scarification ritual, and that's Man Called Horse type stuff, go look up that film. Those are your spells. Your scars, your wounds, your messages written to yourself and hammered into your ribs and your skin and your muscle wall. Those are your spells. And then have a look at the spell schools that you could use. I imagine that a barbarian necromancer would be a very, very creepy thing indeed. Like full skull face tattoos, out there, like this huge big bastard, like walking around in his raven cloak, selecting rise, very creepy, very cool. Or just use transmutations and just say that's actually just rage and it's a lot of buffs, and that's why I've got like a huge strength. Alright, that's it. Barbarians. Long video. Sorry about that. Hope you liked it. Hope you've got some things to think about with Barbarians. And that's all I've got to say. So do all the liking and the sharing and the subscribing and all the rest of it. And thank you. That's it. Go away now. Bye. Bye.